I had spent a lot of time looking at images of identity, what it meant and what it looked like to be Irish, and especially in contemporary terms. And for me, being Irish and growing up in the South, it was a very particular image. It kind of settled really easily within kind of our conceptual canon of what it looks like, simple images of Irishness, like cows and sheep and Guinness and green rolling hills. But when I came north of the border, I started to realize that people's identity and ways and means that they chose to authenticate their identity was something they did on a daily basis. It was kind of continual process of authenticating, a kind of construction of their identity. And it was different for me, and I started to think why, what is that about? And so it's two people identifying as the same race, north and south of the border, but there seemed to be this kind of cultural schism in terms of what it looked like and what it felt like. So when I thought about that a bit longer, I started to think about, well, how does identity operate within a particular region or a particular territory, and within Northern Ireland in particular, post-conflict, we have this representations of the region are really crucial because they help to construct an image of what it looks like within the region and outside of its own provenance. So I started to think about, well, there are these two rivaling tribes, both creating images of their separate identities, constructing images of their separate identities. And I started to think about, how that operates. And oftentimes you end up with this kind of dual representation when you're looking at images of Northern Ireland in conflict, because there are constantly these two opposing forces. And when I realized that, I thought, well, that's really interesting, and actually that's quite exciting, because then it led me to think about this kind of representational instability in terms of images of Northern Ireland, and kind of the notion of identity and how it's constructed here, because it's both things at the same time. It has to be. So in terms of then, I guess, how that led into my work, I started to look around me, and I spent a lot of time even just going about my day-to-day business, looking at what images kind of proliferate, what images come to the fore, what images kind of rise to the surface. A lot of them obviously were relative to conflict in Northern Ireland, really provocative images. But then there are other images that were kind of less provocative, more, I guess, about how we navigate through, our day-to-day lives. Kids in Belfast, in the city centre, kind of the material culture, the clothes they were wearing, and all of these kind of came together in the work in ways where I tried to achieve, I guess, layer the work or embed the work with lots of these images, these kind of various different forces. So the notion of, identity or representation relative to Northern Ireland is something that's really critical to my work. It's something that I think about all the time in terms of choosing images. And I do really like to think about it in terms of kind of it having this type of instability. Because identity is a construct anyway, isn't it? It's something that is very fluid, it's not static, it changes. We can buy identities off the peg online, we can change our identities. And within Northern Ireland, identity is something that we're constantly hashing out. We're trying to articulate it and arbitrate it and mediate identity constantly on a daily basis. And in terms of looking at that, I like to think about images of Northern Ireland as well, not in a static way, not in a way that's kind of just about the here and now, but I think of it in terms of a continuum that, goes backwards in the past, because we're constantly invoking the past in the present tense in a post-conflict territory, aren't we? We're always talking about what has happened, the people we've lost, the conflict. So it's constantly in the present tense, the past and the present tense. And then we're always deferring to the future future possible idealized forms of society, you know. So I think about it in that way, and that's how it operates in my work. Images, I pull images from various different sources that might be contemporary images, and then I would pull an art historical image, or an image from the past, and then kind of embed those into, you know, a piece of work, various different layers, which oftentimes speaks to some idealized sense of a future, possible future, or future possible Ireland. I have this incredible love and fascination with classicism. It's something that's always really, you know, obsessed. I've been obsessed by it. It's never left me. And I've always been trying to achieve, make a piece of work that has some sort of classical allusions. And I love this notion of something hard appearing soft. Bernini does that really well, and he's an artist who, you know, whose work I love. But once I discovered Parian, I started to realize that I could make work that emulated marble, because those are the characteristics of Parian porcelain. It's a derivative of Parian marble, which most of the marbles throughout antiquity would have been made in. And then that, for me, then I started to realize that made a conceptual bridge between the past and notions of classicism, Plato and Cicero, idealized forms of society, you know, the Republic. And then I started to think about, well, how does that operate within Northern Irish society? You know, again, we're always talking about idealized forms, ideal forms of society. Moving forward, let's forget the conflict, ways and means of how, you know, we can coexist and live together. But they're always suspended notions, always continuously suspended. They have to be, because, you know, we're post-conflict, and no society is perfect, obviously, because that would be a utopian society. But so in terms of that kind of connection between idealized forms of society in classicism, that's often much in debate, and potential of an idealized society in Northern Ireland, that's something that I'm pursuing with the Parian porcelain. You know, so the work looks or emulates marble, but I try to embed it then with signs and symbols that are relative to conflict and to territory, to Northern Ireland. So roots it within a very specific context. But then that kind of conceptual continuum comes back into play. So it harks back to the past, to antiquity. It has images that are relative to the contemporary. And then there's an element of surrealism oftentimes in the work, which I really enjoy. I love surrealism. And so I oftentimes would embed that in the work as well, and that kind of, you know, takes it off or ejects the work into some future potential possible realm.